Hello, well, I'm on my travels again, and today I have found myself in the centre of Manchester in the United Kingdom. Absolutely lovely day outside, as you can probably see behind me, some nice blue skies. And the road street you can see just down here is Balloon Street, leading onto Corporation Street, just underneath where I'm sitting, and that all feeds round into Victoria Station, where you might just see, as we go on, some Manchester trams running up and down the road here into Victoria Station and around Greater Manchester itself. Lovely architecture of buildings behind, mixed with new. If you ever get the chance to come to Manchester, you'll have a great time, whatever you want to see and do. But I'm here to read to you once more. We're still reading Mosquito, and hopefully, you may have read or listened with me to the first four chapters of part one, and today we're moving on to chapter five. Let's go. Pilot Officer Ted Sismore had been in the officers' mess at Marham the night Hugh Edwards and his crews had staggered back from the raid against the Burmeister and Wayne plant in Copenhagen. With a beer in hand, he'd enjoyed the revelry as his new comrades in arms toasted the destination of each of their time-delayed bombs in the Danish capital. Only posted to 105 Squadron weeks earlier, the 21-year-old navigator had been left off the B&W mission in favour of more experienced crews. He knew, though, that their success was a far cry from the RAF's first visit to Denmark in August 1940, when 82 Squadron's Blenheims had been savaged in clear blue skies over Aalborg, West Airfield in Jutland. All 11 British bombers were shot down as they made their attack. Of the 33 aircrew on board, only 8 survived. A posting to a Blenheim squadron was, as one wireless operator air gunner realised, likely to result in a very short career. This Sismore also knew only too well. Inspired as a boy by the sky acrobatics, wing walking and formation flying of Alan Cobham's travelling flying circus, Sismore had applied to join the RAF Volunteer Reserve on his 18th birthday in June 1939. Just over 2 months later, and 2 days before war was declared, his father told him, "They're calling up everybody in the reserve. You better go along." Sismore had wanted to be a pilot, but after just 3 or 4 hours of training, he was transferred to the navigator's course. Unhappy about the decision, he decided there and then that he would one day complete his pilot training, but for now he knuckled down. And it seemed that the Air Force had known what they were doing. Described as a keen student by his instructors, his ability as a navigator was recorded as above average. Despite his disappointment, Sismore embraced the role he'd been given and was his own harshest critic if he didn't feel that his navigation was up to scratch, noting any unsatisfactory performances in his logbook. It was an early indication that Sismore, despite his fair, fresh-faced appearance and easygoing manner, was also possessed of a rare steel. He needed it in Malta when he deployed with 110 Squadron to the besieged Mediterranean island at the beginning of July 1941. Of 7 Blenheims that attacked Tripoli harbour on the 9th, 4 were shot down by Italian fighters and anti-aircraft guns. 7 men were killed, 5 taken as prisoners of war. When the squadron returned 9 days later, its acting commanding officer fell victim to a Regia Aeronautica Fiat CR-42 biplane. It only confirmed Sismore's unhappy view that a Blenheim got shot down rather easily. When the Blenheim made its debut, it was faster than any fighter in the RAF. Designed as a passenger aircraft in response to a challenge from Lord Rothermere, the owner of the Daily Mail, to produce the fastest commercial aeroplane in Europe, if not the world, the new machine was always intended to have the potential to be developed into a bomber. First impressions suggested the plan was a success. The Spitfire roared past the Royal Standard at well over 300 miles per hour, followed by the Blenheim, reported Flight magazine from a display put on for King George V, the speed of which was a revelation of what a modern bomber can do. We certainly have a bomber that can outfly any fighter in the world today. But that was in 1936, and times were changing fast. Since then, the relentless progress of aviation technology rendered the Blenheims almost genteel, outclassed, and vulnerable. By 1941, The feathery purr of its twin Bristol Mercury radial engines seemed to belong to a bygone age. But it was no longer Ted Sismore's problem. When 110's Blenheims went into action again 5 days later, he played no part. Hospitalised by a mystery bug that left him too weak to stand, he was medevaced off Malta to Gibraltar on 27th of July. While waiting for passage home, he first heard talk of a new aeroplane that sounded like it might make good on the hopes there had been for the Blenheim, the de Havilland Mosquito. Not even radio broadcasts from Nazi propagandist Lord Haw Haw claimed that his ship would be torpedoed the moment she left Gibraltar could dampen his enthusiasm for the rumoured new machine. His mind was made up. If all the tales are true, he thought, then that's the aeroplane for my next tour. They were. On the very same day that Sismore's commanding officer had been shot down during the raid on Tripoli by a biplane incapable of even reaching 300 miles per hour, the first Mosquito prototype recorded a top speed of 433 miles per hour in level flight. Faster than a Spitfire, faster in fact than any other combat aircraft in the world on either side of the fight. Sismore quickly realised that the hope he'd invested in the Mosquito was not misplaced. In the month he joined 105, the squadron's unarmed bombers had outrun or outmanoeuvred swarms of Focke-Wulf FW-190s to successfully attack the Philips radio works in the Netherlands. During an attack on railways in France, a crew had placed a 500-pound bomb into the mouth of a tunnel to trap a train. And while carrying out an air test, another 105 crew, diving from 30,000 feet and assisted by a tailwind, had been tracked by radar flying at a speed over the ground of nearly 600 miles per hour. Sismore himself had already had good cause to appreciate his new mount when, despite losing his port engine and hydraulics to flak, K for Kilo brought him home from his second mission. It was, thought Sismore, a splendid aeroplane. The wake-up call came at about 3 a.m. It was supposed to have been a day off. 2 days after the CO's epic sortie to Denmark, the squadron had been stood down. But as they'd prepared to go out to the pub, Ted Sismore and his pilot, squadron leader Reggie Reynolds, were told to get an early night. Along with 2 other crews, they were going to fly in the morning after all, although, as the flight van drove them to the ops block in the small hours of 30th of January 1943, it didn't look too promising. A terrible day, thought Sismore as he peered through the window at low cloud and pouring rain whipped up by strong winds, quite unsuitable for any form of operations. The idle chatter between the crews was beginning to warm up as they shook off their sleep when Reynolds shut them all up. It's different today, he told them. We climb after we cross the Elbe. Sismore was puzzled. Hugh Edwards had spent the last 6 months establishing mosquitoes as low-level specialists, hitting at dusk before returning in darkness. Where on earth can we be going if we climb after we cross the Elbe, wondered Sismore, and in broad daylight? Ted Sismore had met Reggie Reynolds after returning from Malta. Both had been posted to the Armstrong-Whitworth Whitley Operational Training Unit. On 2 occasions they had been drafted onto Air Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris's 1,000-bomber raids. Flying over Germany in an aeroplane as slow and vulnerable as the old Whitley was not an experience either cared to repeat, but at least its 2 Merlin engines were reliable. Reynolds had somehow also completed a whole tour on the dreadful Avro Manchester, a machine so notoriously unreliable and unsuccessful that, of the fewer than 200 that reached the front-line squadrons, well over 100 were lost on ops and training. But surviving 207 Squadron earned him a promise from the RAF that he could choose what he flew for his 3rd tour. He wanted the Mosquito, and he wanted to take Sismore with him as his navigator. The pair first flew the Mosquito together on 23rd November 1942. For the next 2 weeks, they flew intensely practicing low-level navigation in the skies around East Anglia and honing their bombing skills on the ranges. By mid-January, they had 5 successful ops under their belts, and while 105 Squadron's newest crew might have missed out on the B&W raid, Reynolds and Sismore had already caught Hugh Edwards' expert eye. Copenhagen would wait. the boss had something even more dramatic in mind for them. The three Mosquito crews walked into the ops room to see a tape stretching across a map on the wall between Marham and Berlin. In case there was any doubt, Berlin was chalked up on the ops board in the target column. All the crews had the same question: do we even have enough fuel for that? There was less debate about the purpose of their mission. Their target was the Haus des Rundfunks, the headquarters of the German state broadcasting company. At 1100 hours, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring would be opening proceedings with a rallying speech to an invited audience in the Air Ministry. Still basking in the afterglow, the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe would then be driven across Berlin to deliver a second speech at the huge Sportspalast indoor arena to warm up the audience of thousands for an operation of his colleague, Reichsmaster of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. The doctor was scheduled to speak at 1600 and would no doubt be doing his best to emulate the Führer, who, he said, rouses the tired and lazy, fires up the indifferent, and the doubting turns cowards into men and weaklings into heroes. That was an occasion for which 105 Sister Squadron 139 had been booked to appear. To disrupt and embarrass the Nazi high command on their big day seemed, in the eyes of the crews, to be fully justified. Happy birthday, Nazis. But the trio, led by Sizemore and Reynolds, had to strike at exactly 11 o'clock. It would be the first RAF daylight raid against Berlin of the war, and the deepest penetration into enemy territory yet made by the de Havilland's Mosquito. The 105 Squadron formation flew at treetop height across Europe, low enough to cause horses to bolt and bystanders to fall to their knees in fright, and to slip unseen beneath the German radar. The three Mosquitoes reached Drachenberg, their last waypoint before Berlin. At 10:22 hours, on schedule, Sizemore recorded the time in his navigation log and directed Reynolds to alter course a few degrees to port and begin the climb to altitude. Flying in echelon to starboard behind them, the other two Mosquitoes, crewed by Flight Lieutenant Gordon and Flying Officer Hayes, and Flying Officer Wickham and Pilot Officer Makin, followed DZ-413 through thick cloud towards their planned altitude of 25,000 feet. Even now, the Mosquito's wooden airframe ensured that they returned only a faint signal on the German radars. Levelling off with 77 miles to run, 10-10 cloud quilted the ground. It was solid all the way. In the lead aircraft, Sizemore scoured the boundless cotton wool below and was beginning to accept that the target just might not reveal itself. I can't see any breaks in the cloud, he told Reynolds. We're going to have to bomb on time. Then, with the bomb bay open, Sizemore spotted what he'd been looking for. Hang on, there's a break. And ahead, to starboard, he could see the lakes that snaked through the southeast of Berlin. And from there, he knew it was his way to the radio station. Inside the imposing setting of the Air Ministry, Göring was announced with a flourish. He walked to the podium and faced his uniformed audience beneath the imposing backdrop of a 30-foot high, carved mural of a spread eagle standing on a swastika. The Reichsmarshal's script compared the Wehrmacht's 6th Army on the verge of being overrun by the Red Army in Stalingrad to the Spartans and their heroic last stand at Thermopylae. Gathered around a radio in the piss-stinking cellars of Stalingrad, the demoralized and defeated remnants of the 6th Army heard Göring introduced, but was no whisper of the Fat One himself. What followed was the sound of British 500-pound bombs exploding across their capital. It sounded like distant thunder. As they exchanged curious glances, the feed from the Air Ministry was cut, replaced by a recording of Bruckner's 7th Symphony in E major. On finally hearing the speech later in the day, one of the soldiers joked, Thermopylae, more like the Jewish last stand and the mass suicide at Masada. The following day, after 5 months of fighting, starved of food and ammunition and burdened by 18,000 injured men they had no means of treating, they surrendered. 2 weeks later, Ted Sizemore, along with the rest of the crews, was awarded the first DFC Distinguished Flying Cross of his career as a Mosquito navigator. The week after that, he visited the de Havilland factory at Hatfield with Reggie Reynolds to speak to the workforce. They thanked them and sang the praises of their wooden wonder. The Berlin raid was a vindication of everything the firm had done against the odds to make their high-speed, unarmed bomber a reality. And it was an indication, thought Sizemore, of some of the things that might be possible. No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr, Goering had declared in 1939. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Goering, you may call me Meyer. All in Germany understood the name Meyer to be an insult, but while the Luftwaffe chief might have been forgiven for ignoring a courageous but isolated attack against Berlin in June 1940, with bombs and a shoe thrown in disgust by the crew of a single antiquated French Navy Farman NC 233.4, the RAF's arrival over the capital was a public humiliation. Goering raged. He had already been concerned about the Mosquito, so much so that on the same day as Berlin raid, he was led to believe that a saboteur, parachuted into Britain the previous month, had succeeded in attacking the de Havilland factory, blown in 2 places, reported the Bavaria spy. From the sky, any aerial photography could confirm the extent of the destruction, while a brief, undercooked story in the Daily Express suggested the British had been hit harder than they wanted to let on. But the whole thing had been a deception, the damage merely set dressing produced by a professional stage magician. And Germany's man was really working for the British all along as a double agent, codenamed Zigzag. It all seemed so unfair. In reply to the best efforts of Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf and Heinkel, the British had come up with a machine of almost flukish brilliance and unnecessary ingenuity. Everyone should come and have a look at this amazingly primitive aircraft, Goering berated his technical heads in words laced with sarcasm. Then they might learn something. What was the point of spending any more time and money developing advanced designs of their own? Let's build the Mosquito. That's the simplest thing to do. Over the months ahead, the group tracked the Mosquito's progress, speculating about its performance with uprated Merlin engines and recordings, sightings of Mosquitoes on the ground at Bromma Airport in Stockholm. They discussed whether or not it might be possible to seize a Mosquito that had force-landed in neutral Switzerland and bring it back to Germany, and in a move that attracted derision from Adolf Galland, his most senior fighter pilot, Goering pulled 2 experienced squadron commanders out of the Eastern Front and charged them with setting up 2 new specialized high-altitude fighter wings. Jagdgeschwader 25 and Jagdgeschwader 50 to take on the Mosquitoes. To no avail, smirked Galland. And what seemed to annoy Goering most of all was the fact that de Havilland's finest was made of wood. The Mosquito's disruption of his speech in Berlin could not have been more perfectly tailored to send him into a tailspin. It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito, he ranted. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford aluminium better than we can, knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over here is building. What do you make of that? They have the geniuses, and we have the geniuses, and we have the nincompoops. After the war is over, I'm going to buy a British radio set, then at least I'll own something that works. It didn't help that Goering and de Havilland had already had history, competing in an air exhibition in Sweden in the summer of 1923. A 30-year-old Hermann Goering had seen all his metal Junkers monoplane beaten by the wooden DH-50 biplane brought by the team from de Havilland. Furthermore, as Goering's petulant jibe highlighted, there were not just piano manufacturers but cabinet makers, coach builders and furniture factories, all equipped with workforces experienced in working with wood. With the collapse in demand for new furniture, businesses like Parker Knoll, Harris Labus in London's East End and E. Gommer in High Wycombe jumped at the chance to become one of over 20 woodworking companies subcontracted to build the Mosquito. In some of these workplaces, men and women in aprons and overalls were still surrounded by examples of the chairs, tables and sideboards that had once been their bread and butter. Well-drilled production lines lifted and moved warped wooden fuselage sections from moulds, wobbled long sheets of plywood into place over one piece of winged skeletons of wooden spars and ribs, and pushed lumber through circular saws. If one factory fell to Luftwaffe bombs, Mosquito production could continue unabated at others. Beyond the woodworking factories, companies as diverse as Claude Butler's Bicycles, Decca Records, Addis Brush, Electrolux Home Appliances, Pi Radio, the Co-op, and even the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, which made tail and rudder fittings, were drafted in to contribute. There was even a cottage industry of willing men and women making component parts for the Mosquito. The Hales, a couple recently retired from the Far East and living in Old Welwyn, Hertfordshire, invited friends and neighbours round to the house, feng shui, to produce bonding flexes in a shed at the bottom of the garden. By 1943, the Mosquito was unstoppable, and yet, despite de Havilland's success in building a machine that morale-boosting Pathé News reports described as an aeronautical marvel or a wonder weapon of the air, the Mosquito's first year in service with Bomber Command had not been an easy one. The Berlin raid earned a congratulatory message from Sir Arthur Harris, Bomber Command's Commander-in-Chief. He was generous in his praise. Please convey to all concerned, and particularly to the crews of the aircraft, my warmest congratulations on the magnificent daylight attack carried out on Berlin by your Mosquitoes. But Harris didn't really like the Mosquito in comparison with the four-engine heavies he'd been tasked with sending in night over the night to pulverize German cities. By the end of the war, he was even asked to have the word Mosquito omitted wherever possible from communiques. He felt that the impudent, fleet-footed light bomber somehow detracted from the overall gravity of the Bomber Command effort. It didn't matter. With rave reviews for the raids on the Oslo Gestapo HQ, Burmeister and Wayne, and now Reynolds and Sismore's gleefully satisfying show over Berlin, the Mozzie had won the hearts and minds of the British public. And with Huey Edwards promoted away from the front line, following the Berlin op, it would be for men like Ted Sismore to burnish the Mosquito's growing reputation. In his time as boss of 105 Squadron, though, the Australian VC had ensured that whatever Bomber Harris thought, the Mosquito's future was safeguarded. After an uncertain first year in service, de Havilland's Wooden Wonder looked to have found its groove. The same could not be said of Ralph Hollingworth's Danish section. Chapter 6. The day after the Oslo raid, Christian Rutball, SOE's 25-year-old chief organizer, was gunned down in the street after a police raid on his apartment. Ralph Hollingworth's efforts to establish agents in the field had been blighted with appalling misfortune. His first choice as chief organizer of SOE's operation in Denmark had been Karl Brun. The now qualified doctor who'd signed the Bible alongside Anders Lassen as one of the Holly's first class of Danish recruits. Brun was killed in December 1941 when, jumping into Denmark from an RAF Armstrong Whitworth Whitley bomber, his parachute failed to open. Under increasing pressure from his boss, Colin Gubbins, to do some damage in Denmark, it was a devastating blow to Holly's plans. Forced to improvise, he chose the hastily trained Rotbull as Brun's replacement, only to lose him 6 months after he was parachuted in. It was hardly the kind of progress Gubbins had been hoping for when he produced a report titled Present Situation in Denmark and Directive as to Future Policy at the end of August 1942. There has been no successful delivery of stores and no SOE-inspired sabotage has been carried out, said Baker Street's Chief of Operations. It was hardly surprising that, given of the 10 agents parachuted in Denmark by Hollingworth before the end of 1942, 4 were killed, 4 captured, and another would have to be dismissed for poor security. Instead, Holly was forced to rely on a handful of intelligence officers from the Danish Army's General Staff, codenamed the Princes. But they would not risk their intelligence network through conducting acts of sabotage, and they would have preferred it if SOE stopped encouraging it too. Gubbins was characteristically blunt. My reading of the position is that they wish to keep their country absolutely free of any sabotage or anti-German action until the Germans break up altogether and begin to leave the country. The Princes had not, as far as he was aware, done one single act which has adversely affected the Germans, and so Denmark is an asset to them and in no way a liability. That, he told Hollingworth, had to change, now. The catalyst for change had come in the form of 105 Squadron's Mosquito raid on Copenhagen's Burmeister and Wain diesel factory. An SOE agent in Stockholm had requested a demonstration bombing against a target in Copenhagen at a time when the Air Ministry was discussing strikes against industrial targets in a number of occupied territories. When the Burmeister and Wain plant came up for discussion again on the 4th of December 1942, SOE's representative on the Target Information Committee was encouraging. As well as hitting B&W's ability to make parts for the German U-boat engines, it was hoped to have a similar effect on the morale of the Danish population as two groups' raid on Oslo had in Norway. At a meeting a fortnight later, Bomber Command confirmed that two groups' Mosquito force was strongly interested in carrying out an attack. Proponents of the raid could not have been more delighted with the results achieved by Huey Edwards and his crews, and nor, it seemed, could the Danes themselves. In Copenhagen, home-knitted berets in the concentric blue and red circles of the RAF's roundel became a fashion item. So too did brass split-pin paper fasteners, which people would paint with the same logo and attach to their buttonhole, offering a more discreet way of showing support and appreciation. Germans tried to paint the Mosquitoes as instruments of terror, but no one was buying it. Instead, newspapers soon carried advertisements from companies selling Mosquito models, only 230 kroner plus postage. After 3 years on the back foot in Europe, North Africa and Asia, the Allies, had finally begun to meaningfully turn things around. The flying fortresses of the US Army Air Corps 8th Air Force had arrived in Europe. Rommel had been beaten in El Alamein, and Germany's assault on the Soviet Union had stalled. And of the RAF's increasing success as an offensive weapon against Germany, Churchill felt confident in claiming that henceforth they will have to face into many theatres of war the superiority in the air, which they have so often used without mercy against others, of which they boasted all round the world, and which they intended to use as an instrument for convincing all other peoples that all resistance was hopeless. This was well and good, but Hollingwirth was still without a permanent chief organiser in the field. That was about to change, but there would be a lot riding on the next candidate he parachuted in to take the reins, and in some respects it looked like he'd made a questionable choice. So that is chapters 5 and 6 of Mosquito, still in part 1. Obviously chapter 7 comes next, and that will come in another recording. Meanwhile, I'm going to enjoy a bit of time here in Manchester.